for consideration for endorsement by the caucus. I will put the Google form in the chat here momentarily, but please do get your bills in. We do plan on starting the consideration fairly soon after that 4 p.m. deadline tomorrow. We have received maybe about half a dozen bills so far, and if anyone needs to check if theirs came through, feel free to send me a message and I'll check for you.
And one last thing on the endorsement process, we do want to remind folks that we really need you to vote when once the endorsements come in. Says our process is that it is we need a quorum, which is a majority of members to have voted to be able to endorse bills. And so once the endorsement process comes, once the requests come in and we send out the endorsements for voting, really important for folks to put your votes in. I know some of you were texted at the last minute, and thanks for coming through. But if everyone can do it earlier, we can get that endorsement process done. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to co-chair, Senator Malcolm Augustine, and he will lead us through today.
Thank you, Delegate Charkoudian. I'm very pleased to be here with everyone today. This is obviously going to be our first of two briefings that we're going to have, and on this day we're going to concentrate on our we're going to hear from DLS, and we're going to talk about some of the federal matters that are before us, and then we'll also hear from APTA, which is an organization that looks at these public transit issues from from a national perspective. And so I'm looking forward to hearing this, and we're going to start with Steve McCullough. And Steve, are you on with us today?
I am.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome to the Transit Caucus.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, is that showing okay?
Yes.
Okay, so talking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA.
I just need to turn my sound down.
Hey, sorry, I was a little behind. I just saw it.
Just kind of a general overview. As most of you have probably seen over the past few weeks since the legislation was signed back in November by the president, the IIJA provides $1.2 trillion in infrastructure funding. That is not all new money, however. There's about $550 billion that represents new money. The remaining money, the IIJA also included reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Program. So that's where that comes in. And as you can see from this chart, transportation makes up the largest section of infrastructure funding through that act. Coming to Maryland, we expect a total of almost $8.2 billion over 5 years. Of that, $2.8 billion would comprise new or enhanced funding. And you can see here the various categories that Maryland will be looking to receive. And again, because transportation is the biggest at the national level, it's also by far the largest segment coming to Maryland. The funding for Maryland for transportation is coming, totals about $6.9 billion over the 5 years. 1.5 of that new money is not currently programmed in the Maryland Transportation Program. And you can see the breakout here of the roads and bridges, public transportation or transit, and then the other funding sources shown there on the breakout to the right. The transit funding nationally totals about $108 billion. There are, you will see in some stories, different numbers, a lower number, and that is generally has to deal with this black segment of the pie. The legislation approved highway trust fund dollars. They approved advanced appropriations. Both of those are kind of guaranteed pots of money. It also authorized $17 billion in authorized appropriations, but those are subject to appropriation by Congress. So many times that 17 million is left off of totals when talking about kind of transit funding through the bill. But if Congress comes through in each of the years and appropriates the authorized funding, then that will total $108 billion. This chart shows the formula programs for FTA formula programs, and it compares the gold bars are the new funding that will be authorized through the IIJA, compared to the red, which is the prior funding levels through the FAST Act. As you can see, there's a nearly 35% increase in formula funding for the various programs, and in descending order, you can see the areas to which those funding is being supplied. In addition to that, the Act provides $36.8 billion in discretionary funding or grant programs for which states and local governments and even non-governmental agencies will be able to compete. And the largest segment, the top two, same program, what the first line is subject to appropriation, the other is advanced appropriations, is the capital investment program. So this is the new starts, the small starts, and the core capacity grants that jurisdictions can apply for. So some things to keep in mind, there are no IIJA funds that are currently in the Maryland budget. Things just got too late to do that. In addition, agencies are waiting for federal guidance on, how things will be allocated and the requirements, especially for some, the new programs. The matching and funding parameters are very, program specific. So it's hard to generalize how this money coming in will be utilized. And I do have a separate PDF that just shows changes made to the infrastructure through the Infrastructure Investment Act to some of the programs. This is a 5-page document. I'm not going to go through them all, but just have that, and we'll provide that to email for anybody that would like a copy of that. So that really concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, colleagues. Do you have any questions for Steve? You can raise hand function, and I see Delegate Learman, you have your hand raised.
Thanks. Hi, Steve. Good to see you. Could you talk a little bit, or do we have any guidance, or is there much information out about how states can compete? What will the sort of broad categories, or sort of how can you be competitive competing for some of the competitive grant programs, right? So within each of those, do we know, what makes somebody's bus testing facility better than others? Are these, do we have any timelines yet? Like if we don't have something ready, within the next 6 months, is it too late? Like, I'm just curious if we have any. Yeah.
So there are, as you can see on this, there are 4 programs that are italicized. Those are new programs. And so very little is known at this point, what the requirements will be. And so really we have to wait on those. But a lot of the other ones, have been around, and although they are being tweaked, many of the same kind of concepts will apply, especially look at the big one, the Capital Investment Grant Program. That's where the purple line is being funded through as a new starts program, small starts. In all of these federal funds, and it's very similar to how the state treats, local jurisdictions, there are ways of improving chances of receiving funds. And one of those ways is to provide a bigger local match. Obviously, that allows funds to go further. So that's always, one strategy for doing that. With the rest of it, readiness obviously is key. and having, complete, planning done and ready to go. But I think everybody, is in that same boat at this point. And so a lot of it will really depend on the guidance that the federal agencies start providing to answer those kind of specific questions. But there are some kind of overarching goals that the federal administration has, proposed for how this funding should be looked at. That is, with safety, with climate, addressing climate issues, and addressing equity through the projects. So those are kind of the lenses that the federal agencies have been instructed to use. And to the extent any project that Maryland proposes can check all of those boxes, will obviously improve the chances.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCulloch. In the chat, there were a couple of questions about members receiving copies of your presentation. And I'm assuming that you are perfectly comfortable with that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I did email your office and Delegate Charkoudian's office with the documents already, but I could also email anybody directly that would.
It's wonderful that you would be able to be in touch. I think that we do intend to share it with everybody. I just wanted to make sure that we talked about it a little bit. So
absolutely.
Fantastic. Delegate Polakovich-Carr, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is in regards to potential pots of money for pedestrian and bicyclist safety. Can you flag either in these competitive grant programs or in the formula funding that I think was on the previous slide, which, if any of those pots might be able to use for those kinds of safety projects?
For safety projects that are addressing current infrastructure, those are likely to be through the highway side of programs, although obviously as transit, let's see if I don't have the breakdown. Pedestrians and bicyclists are often, using the road network. And so those are the pots that are generally safety in the transit area is probably more likely to apply to safe vehicles, fixing the platforms, things like that. Although there may be some ancillary uses for that, but it's probably the highway and roads funding that is more applicable to that area.
Thank you.
Okay, Delegate Teresa, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for this great presentation. Just a question about slide 6. If you could just talk a little bit more about what we're looking at there. I wasn't sure what those things were on the left-hand side. What are
okay? So these are the formula programs that FTA administers, and so when you hear about transit funding coming from the feds, they don't just give states and locals, one pot of money and say, here, go spend it how you want. There are lots of different pots of money that make up that total funding. So the urbanized area formula, as the name suggests, goes to large areas with dense population. State of good repair is a formula program to help the transit agencies make sure that their facilities and their vehicles are in a state of good repair, being able to use as designed. The rural formula program goes to non-urbanized areas. So each of these has its own distribution formula based on certain factors with the urban and the rural. Obviously, the biggest one is population. There's also a bus program for bus procurement. Some of that is in the new act, is really focused on electrification, moving towards all electric or zero emission buses. And then there are a few smaller programs for planning and elderly disabled grant funding that goes out. So again, those are the various pots that get distributed through the formulas.
So, and then what is the growth and density? Is that an area, a type of area, the growth and density in the middle?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah, so there are challenges that areas that are, growing or becoming more dense face, and they may not be on quite the level where they get bumped up to an urban area, but they do have challenges. So, again, these are just, each of these areas in the past have been an identified need that the Congress has, put through the formula or the statutes to address various places.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Delegate Healy has a question. Delegate Healy?
Oh, you're on mute, Delegate.
You hear me okay now?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I'd like to focus on the elderly and disabled grants. That money, is that the whole country, or is that just Maryland that you're talking about? The two?
That is the entire country. This is national figures.
Okay, and it is billions, it's not millions. Okay, so let me ask you about the program in general for elderly and disabled. One of the issues that I have come across here in Maryland is the fact that paratransit is tied to local metro, like in the DC area, it's WMATA, in the Baltimore region, it's MTA. And if you live in one of those regions and you have a doctor's appointment in another region, which are actually less than 30 miles apart, then you can't get paratransit. And I wondered if there is any way you could use some of this money to bridge that gap.
I will have to, look at that and get back to you on the specifics of that. I do know that, as you point out, the paratransit is only required within 3/4 of a mile of a fixed route. And so that, as you know, applies to WMATA system and the MTA system in Baltimore. But in rural areas, the number of fixed routes may be much smaller. So,
well, even so, for where I live inside the DC Beltway, to get to for example, in Baltimore, I can't use any kind of, there's no public transportation that would take me as a senior citizen to a medical appointment. And it's not just what you're describing. It is really a statewide issue. We're a small state, but we have these different regions, and I just try to find a way that all the people in the state can work. You don't have to be rural to have this problem.
yes, but as I said, I will kind of look into that and get back to you in terms of where there might be some synergy. It is not a big pot of money in Maryland that comes, as you might imagine, with even the enhanced funding, $2 billion, spread out across all of the states and over 5 years.
Yeah.
So Delegate Healy, I could just put my WMATA former board member hat on and say that the paratransit service relates to the American with Disabilities Act, and therefore it really acts to provide public transportation services that are equivalent to the services that would be provided by the service provider. So because WMATA does not travel from, traveled from Hyattsville, where you are, up to Baltimore as a part of their service that's provided, they're not going to provide that as a service. I mean, it's not. And so
I'm
that's just kind of
I'm
like,
aware of those limitations. I'm just trying to find a workaround that we could provide that service to the people here in Maryland,
okay.
wherever the money comes from or whoever does it.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem, but that's just, that is, we have to probably work together to find some other place
Thank you.
in order to work through that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Delegate Foley has a question. And welcome, Delegate Foley.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, on both counts. Mr. McCulloch, I believe it was the next slide. I can't remember the order that they were in, but there was, yes, here, there was money for ferries, rural ferries. Where did I say it? Ferry service for rural communities. And that looks like that's new money. Is that, what's envisioned there? We have an issue in my district with a ferry, the White's Ferry, that was discontinued, and we're looking to help get it restarted. There are a lot of issues with Virginia, and I just wondered, as you know, if we could do like across state lines on a project like that, or is this money just for Maryland? If you could give me some more details about that.
Okay, so the two programs showing for ferries, ferry service for rural communities, and that's going to also be kind of that same population density requirement. So I don't know if White's Ferry will qualify for that. I do know that in Maryland right now, there are only down in Wycomico County is the only place where there is publicly operated ferries that are receiving federal funds. They get about $100,000 a year. And then the second program is for electric or low emitting ferries. So that's similar to the bus electrification project. The idea would be, and again, neither of these programs have rules promulgated or criteria established yet by FTA. We'll be waiting on that. But we can imagine that the low emitting ferry program will be competitive grants to help agencies that are running ferries to transition to electric or low emitting ferries.
Thank you. So that's just public entities that are administering ferries, or could it be a private partnership, or?
I don't know if it's limited to public entities only. I'll check into that. I had looked when these new programs appeared. I'd looked to see, if Maryland actually received any funding through ferry programs, and that's where I discovered that there are two ferries down in Wycomico County that operate and do receive federal funds. So, but I will check to see if non-public agencies can also receive that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised right now, but I have a question as well, which is, given how Maryland has done historically in some of these areas, can you provide some guidance on what you think we may be able to see as far as investments in Maryland from this large funding opportunity?
Well, I think, it falls into two areas, formula and non-formula. The formula and discretionary. Since formula funding is increasing by 35%, I think that, it'd be reasonable at this point to assume that the formula funding coming to Maryland will probably, increase close to that, to that level. And that because it's mostly, it's existing formulas. There are programs out there that are already, receiving the funds. They will get more for the purposes, that may be put on additional funding. As I said, some of the emphasis that FTA will be looking at, they may encourage even existing formula programs to start, looking at those areas. For the competitive grant programs, that is really dependent on the projects and how well they stack up against projects throughout the nation in terms of getting it. But the fact that the funding, even on the competitive stuff, is much greater than it's been in the past speaks well for everybody's, ability to at least get some of that funding for their own projects.
Right, I agreed. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess also just where I was thinking is that, for example, not everyone has fixed guideway, right? I mean, whereas Maryland, we actually do have, we actually have a place where we can apply even for some of these pots of money, similar to what you were talking about for the ferry service, where you had to go and find out that we actually have some place to actually apply for those kinds of things. So I just think that, just circling all the way back to where we started, and thank you so much for presenting to us with what Delegate Zimmerman said. Do you think that there are any things that we as a Transit Caucus should or could be doing to better position the state for particularly these competitive grant programs, just to and final kind of conclusion?
I think, again, for competitive grant programs, it's important that the kind of preliminary work on the planning get done. For the fixed guideway, the capital investment program, there are 2 steps before a full funding grant agreement can be signed, and that includes the planning and development phase of the project, and that's where everything gets lined up for the project, defining what the project is, but also an important component of that is lining up non-federal share so that the feds know that when they decide they're going to select that project and fund it, that there's complete non-state, non-federal funding is available and committed. So, and that's often, especially with projects that may be running through multiple jurisdictions, is sometimes a challenge to, get that last piece of funding. So the funding, lining up the funding is obviously a key component of that. And then even for, big projects, following that planning is, detailed engineering that, again, to come start focusing down on what the project will actually look like. And so to the extent there can be, support on all levels of government across jurisdictions, all of that, I think, positions projects much better than if there are a lot of unknowns going in.
Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate that. Chair Charkoudian, do you have any questions for Mr. McCullough?
Thank you. No, I don't. I had similar questions about how do we position the state. I think those are really important questions as we're looking at policies this year. But I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, listen, we just want to really thank you, Steve, for joining us this morning. I'm sure that if folks have some follow-ups or questions or anything else like that, you'd be more than happy for them to do that with you. I really
absolutely
thank you. Really appreciated your presentation today, and for sharing with us what is going on in the federal space from DLS's perspective. Now we're going to move on to hear a different perspective. We're going to hear the perspective from a broader perspective from the American Public Transportation Association, which of course is a broader perspective. And we're very fortunate to be joined today by Ward McCarriger, who is the Vice President for Government Affairs and Advocacy. So I just want to welcome you here, and we look forward to hearing from you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Augustine and Delegate Charkoudian. I appreciate the opportunity to be here as a Maryland resident. It's always great to talk to my own representatives. So as you mentioned, kind of APTA is a national association. We represent both the public transit agencies and the private sector businesses that support both public transit and high-speed rail. And Jared, if you can go ahead and share the screen.
Absolutely.
We're focused on really 4 key initiatives right now in terms of APTA. One, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, or Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Second, the transportation or TIJA appropriations bill. Third, the Build Back Better bill, budget reconciliation. And fourth, a bill entitled S3011, the Fiscal Recovery Funds Infrastructure Flexibility Act. I'm going to focus on the IIJA and the transportation or TIJA appropriations bill, because right now there's really no clear legislative path forward on the Build Back Better bill or S3011. Very briefly on those two, the Build Back Better bill provides an additional $10 billion for transit, $10 billion for high-speed rail, and some important tax credits. S3011 provides more than $100 billion of state and local funding that could be used for public transportation from some of the COVID relief funds that were made available earlier. But as I noted, neither bill really has a clear path forward right now, and we'll have to see between now and later in the spring how those move forward. So as we talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and specifically the public transit funding, it's a great opportunity for Maryland and all the states. If you can go ahead and advance, Jared. It provides $108 billion for public transit over the next 5 years. So the overall program is going to grow from $13 billion to up to about $21 billion each year. But as an industry overall, we're going to have to deliver. And I think, Senator Augustine, you and others have kind of raised some of the key issues here. One issue is the difficulty in matching this significant increase in federal funding. Some communities will face that. Typically for federal transit grants, not across the board, but general rule is 80% federal funds, 20% non-federal. Sometimes that grows to 50% non-federal, but that will be an issue for certain communities. Second is many agencies are facing capacity issues. So as you think about competitive grants, as you were discussing, the ability of staff to really write competitive grant applications, conduct the necessary procurements, and manage construction projects. Given some of the worker shortage issues that we're facing, those are not simply operator issues. We're kind of seeing them across the board in the industry right now. Next slide. So this slide illustrates kind of the incredible growth of both the formula funding and competitive grant funding under the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So APTA has been strongly encouraging FTA to issue its formula apportionments for fiscal year 2022. I expect as early as this week, they are going to go ahead with a partial apportionment. So this will not reflect all the funding, but it will affect, in essence, the first 4 months of funding that's been appropriated to this point. And that will also, I think, provide some real guidance as to what special emphases is FTA looking at. Now, on the formula side, they're very, kind of, it's up to the local communities to decide how to spend those funds in terms of within the formula eligibilities. But I do think you'll get some hints about their interest. More importantly, I think we're going to also see significant increased funding for competitive grants. So up to this more than 36, almost $37 billion in competitive grant funding. And DOT has begun issuing what are known as notices of funding opportunities, or NOFOs, and more on the way. So last Friday, they issued one for what are known as RAISE grants. This is not a transit specific program. It's a DOT program for multimodal grants. They issued that last Friday. You've got until April to submit your applications. On low and no emission bus grants, we expect those to be issued hopefully in February. They will do the first annual allocation of those funds. And then more generally, the bus capital grants, we expect the opportunity kind of for the solicitation to become available by the end of the first quarter of 2022. Now, the other element to this is that the grants are significantly greater than in past years in terms of the total amount available. raised grants is $1.5 billion this year nationally that's available under the competitive grant program. For the low and no emission bus grants, it's $1.1 billion. That's more than 6 times greater than we've ever seen for that particular program. And it will be that level each year for the next 5 years. Now, Steve mentioned some of the new programs. In essence, there are 4 new programs, such as the ASAP program, which is making rail stations accessible for persons with disabilities. I don't think we'll see any further action on those until Congress completes action on the Transportation Appropriations Bill. That they're limited under the current kind of process to issue notices about the specific funding for those and how the program will be designed until they get a full year allocation. But Senator Augustine, you kind of mentioned the amounts. APTA, in terms of what will Maryland receive, APTA has done some estimates, and we estimate that for the formula funding, it will grow from $260 million in fiscal year 2021 to more than $353 million in fiscal year 2022. And then it will grow much more slowly over the next couple of years, more at a higher inflation rate. That'll be, in essence, by the end of that period, they'll have $386 million in 2026. So over the 5 years, Maryland should receive $1.85 billion. That's a $550 million increase, 42% increase in its formula funds. Now, as I mentioned, as a general rule, Maryland will have to provide the 20% match for these funds. In addition, as you think about the competitive grants, and Maryland will like to, very likely seek some of those for zero emission buses, the ASAP station accessibility, the new rail car replacement program. You will need to kind of identify your state and local match. And I think that's an important issue to begin now, because some of those programs will require a higher match of up to 50%. Then I think more generally, just in terms of trying to deal with the workload here, I think a key issue for MTA or WMATA or any of the other entities in Maryland are to really prioritize which grants to seek. These pie chart, in terms of even with this growth, this only reflects the transit funding. As I mentioned, there's other DOT money for the raised grants. There are all kinds of new Federal Highway Administration programs that also have transit eligibility. Lastly, I would mention on the regulatory front, we expect the administration, that there's not a lot of new regulation in the transit space in the bipartisan infrastructure law. The one area where there is on Buy America requirements. And we do expect the administration to provide additional guidance on that soon. And once they do, then US DOT will use that to determine whether FTA's, the Federal Transit Administration's, current Buy America requirements meet those standards. So under current law for Buy America, the steel, iron, and manufactured goods all need to be made in the United States. That's all part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, but the added element is that they added construction materials. And that is not something that's currently covered by the transit Buy America requirements. I think based on our discussions with FTA, I think it's likely that it will be covered as they move forward. We'll learn more about that this spring. Now, I know I've thrown a bunch of numbers at you and a lot of other facts. You can find all this on APTA's Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Hub, and Jared or I will throw in the chat when we're done kind of the link to it. This, in essence, is APTA is using this to track both grant opportunities and the new agency guidance. It includes our summaries of all these funding amounts and these estimates of the state apportionment tables, and then section by section analyses. It also includes different White House and DOT guidance. And then we're going to begin a series of webinars on specific issues to help agencies and other entities, communities, better understand the law in terms of as it moves to implementation. So we're having one in 2 weeks on zero emission bus transition plans. That's a requirement to apply for what will be a new requirement for the low no bus program. Some agencies already have those, so this will be transit agencies talking about what they've included in some of their transition plans previously. And then very briefly on the Transportation Appropriations Act. Next slide, please. So Congress at this point has not completed its work on appropriations. It's working under what's known as a continuing resolution, basically last year's funding through February 18th. As Congress works to finalize this year's appropriations bill this year and this spring, APTA really has 2 key objectives. One is to ensure that that act, the TIJA Act, reflects and honors the bipartisan infrastructure law. And there are really 2 elements to that. One is, first, it needs to, in essence, match the amounts that were provided under that law for the guaranteed funding levels. Without that action, you will not see in this year any of the $3.2 billion of mostly formula guaranteed funding. So all those big increases I outlined for Maryland won't happen if Congress does not include complete action on the transportation appropriations bill, and in essence, increase the amounts to what Congress just enacted last fall. We do expect that to happen, but it does need to happen. Second is we want to ensure there's a part of the bill that's not guaranteed, and Steve kind of touched on this. It's the Capital Investment Grant Program. So we want to ensure that that funds new starts, small starts, core capacity projects. Maryland has the purple line that's under construction right now that is within that program. And we're seeking the highest possible funding for that. In fiscal year 2021, Congress appropriated $2 billion for that program. Next slide, please. So I think if you look, under the IIJA, they advance appropriated 1.6. So we've got kind of that in the bank right now. But it also authorized an additional $3 billion on top of that it will be subject to the annual appropriations process. So our objective really is to get that full $4.6 billion for the program. Next slide. So currently there are 77 projects in the pipeline. That this is FTA's pipeline for CIG projects. And that's everything from a $20 million bus rapid transit project in Waco, Texas, to the $12 billion Hudson River Tunnel in the New York region. In total, they're requesting more than $36 billion of CIG funds. Next slide. So to help our advocacy efforts, APTA has created a dashboard to track these CIG projects in FTA's pipeline. And it really serves 2 purposes for us. One is to demonstrate the need. And then second is as an advocacy tool to try to develop a group of senators and representatives to advocate on behalf of the highest possible level of funding. Now, for Maryland right now, you can see, on this first page of our table, Maryland has the purple line. Right now, it has most of the money from the federal government has already been provided. It has $95 million remaining that is due. I would expect when the Appropriations Act is completed that Maryland will receive, in essence, that final allocation in fiscal year 2022. Now, of the other 77 projects right now, I don't believe Maryland has any other projects in the pipeline. And I would state that if Maryland is thinking about the Red Line, other BRT projects, any new projects I'm not aware of, I would strongly encourage the state to get in the queue as soon as possible. we've seen a different approach under probably this administration than the prior administration, just in terms of transit agencies getting into this queue. More than 20 different projects have joined the queue in the last year. So there's an enormous amount of demand for it. And then finally, very briefly, I just wanted to touch on transit ridership. So APTA also tracks kind of both national and by system ridership. And this chart reflects our real-time estimates of what's happening with ridership right now. And I think what we've seen is it's been growing slowly throughout the year, but it's very dependent on what's occurring in the community. So as Omicron has surged in different communities, you see ridership retreat as travel to and within the cities decreased. For Maryland systems, it's a little hard to read, I know, that the bright blue line is the national, but most of the Maryland systems are slightly below the national average in ridership, relatively consistently. That doesn't surprise me in terms of just our review of this, because for one, obviously the MARC system would be included in that. And commuter rail ridership overall has been much slower to grow than, say, bus systems. Similarly, WMATA, with its kind of high commuter ridership element to who uses it and the high federal workforce side, it's also less than the national average, and I don't find that surprising. Agencies across the board are kind of looking at this post-pandemic landscape and are considering changes to their service offerings. We think between the COVID relief funding and the new bipartisan infrastructure law, they have the resources to plan for that future. And so I think with that, I will finish up, and thank you very much for your time. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you so very much for your presentation. I'm trying to take a look inside of the chat as I do, and if those who come up with questions, oh, I see. Delegate Corman has a question. Delegate Corman.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ward, thanks so much for being here. So I'm 15 years from working on the Hill, so I can't remember exactly how it all works, but your discussion of what's authorized versus what's appropriated is a little alarming, because I think we're headed for a different Congress pretty soon, spoiler alert. And thus far, I haven't heard this as a, repeal and replace kind of a policy, but I mean, are you tracking this at all? I mean, are we really confident that 2 years from now, they're going to be still appropriating off of this Congress's bipartisan infrastructure deal?
Well, I would say we're definitely monitoring it. So it is an issue that is absolutely on our radar. I think our first step is ensuring that this Congress kind of get those first year levels. That is where, if you think about that table, that's the first year is where you see the huge jump in funding. And then after that, it really levels off. So getting this first year is critically important. I think in terms of, would a Republican Congress revisit this? I think there are two parts to that question. One is the guaranteed funding, I think, will be difficult to revisit. It would be vetoed as a standalone bill, I think, by the president. However, if it were part of a debt limit discussion, something much bigger that has nothing to do with transportation, but we did see that in the Obama administration, where President Obama took certain cuts to programs that he didn't support, but they were part of a debt limit resolution of a budget agreement. That is a remote possibility, but it definitely is a possibility we're monitoring. And then second really is on the capital investment grant piece, which is really subject to each year's annual appropriations. That number could move considerably, based on the interest of different members in a different Congress.
Thank you.
Okay. Delegate Solomon.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Ward, thank you for your presentation, and I would echo Delegate Corman having PTSD from the super committee back in 2011. Just a question for you, your opinion on this. So a number of us are working on, putting together what we hope will be a really expansive plan for our MARC rail system. And I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are. I know that the guidebook came out or it's coming out this afternoon from the White House, but any sense from FTA? I know there's going to be a huge pot of money for the Northeast corridor specifically. What do you think Maryland needs to do to be competitive to make sure that when FTA looks at other applications, they don't just think Maryland's getting Maryland will benefit from the Northeast Corridor money and we don't need to care about Brunswick or any other lines that we have.
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity. So one area is the capital investment grants, the CIG program. And that would be kind of the traditional way to pursue it. But I also think that it partly depends how big of a project maybe you're thinking of. I think on a smaller scale, and depending on how much federal funding you're seeking, the RAISE grant program, there will be other new federal highway congestion relief programs that aren't really fully up and running yet, but there is real opportunity there. I think we kind of saw pretty substantial differences between, say, the Obama administration and its implementation of RAISE grants versus the Trump administration and now the Biden administration. In the Democratic administration, you saw about 30% on average or more going to transit or passenger rail of RAISE grants. It was substantially less in the Trump administration, but that's a renewed opportunity and something that APTA has really emphasized with the Biden administration.
Thank you so much for that answer. Just again, scanning to see if others have questions. I have a curiosity for you. The number that you referenced for this state of Maryland, did that include WMATA?
I think it includes the attribution of Maryland of WMATA. So you can also find, we do have, say, if you're interested in how much does the Washington region get overall, which would be WMATA, the primary recipient of those funds. We do have it by urbanized area too. So you can see for the larger urbanized areas, those more than 200,000, you could see Baltimore or the Washington area in terms of how much overall, again, with the vast majority of that going to WMATA.
And where would, can you share that with us as far as like links and places that people can go to find that information? You all have a wealth of information, obviously.
Absolutely. So Jared, if you can throw in the chat the link for our hub, and if you look on that hub, you'll find a category that's kind of funding and apportionment tables, and you'll find as much detail there as we have at this point. I do think you'll get kind of the official numbers in part for fiscal year 2022 as early as later this week when FTA issues its notice.
Fantastic. But your piece there can help us also to get a sense of what's happening across the country, correct? Mm-hmm. Thank you. The other question that I had for you is that there's been a tremendous amount of discussion, obviously on the capital side, but we have real shortfalls on our operating budgets. Has there been any discussion about a change of policy and getting some support for operating budgets at the federal level?
There's been some, but you see less of that probably in the bipartisan infrastructure law itself. So all of the COVID relief funding, we in the last 2 years got $70 billion nationally for COVID relief. All of that is for operating and primarily intended for operating assistance. And most systems have either been, have used it or are using it, kind of closing it out in the next year or two in terms of that available funding. There aren't a lot of changes in terms of the ability to use these infrastructure dollars for operating assistance. But the way that the transit formula works today is that if you're under 200,000 in population, you can use those funds for operating assistance. It's a 50-50 match. So for smaller communities, they can still do that. You can't do it for anyone who's a big city recipient.
Okay, thank you so very much. Delegate Charkoudian, do you have any final questions for Mr. McCarriger?
I'm good. I don't have any questions. Thank you. I was just going to close by reminding folks about voting again, if I could jump in and do that.
Of course. First, let's just say thank you to Mr. McCarriger for joining us. Wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you will be open to us reaching back out to you if it's okay with you, if we have any other questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you so very much. Delegate Charkoudian?
Yes, thank you both to Mr. McCullough and Mr. McCarriger for your presentations, and thanks again to everybody for joining. And most of you were on at the beginning, but in case you weren't, just a quick reminder to get your bills in to be considered for a transit caucus endorsement, and a huge reminder to be sure to vote when the voting list goes out so that we get enough votes quickly. Do you have a question, Delegate Foley, about that? No. Okay. To make sure that we get enough votes so that we can quickly endorse the next round of bills. And thank you so much. And oh, and one other reminder, which is that February 14th is our next briefing, and you should have received that briefing. We will have, just looking at who we actually have.
We're going to have APTA and
Amada's
MTA.
here. Go ahead.
APTA and MTA.
Great. Okay. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.